Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about workflows. I know we are in a new Power Automate world, but I still think that there is a place for old Dynamics 365 workflows, and these can be really helpful to new administrators getting started, but sometimes the settings can be a bit scary. So we're going to walk through each of those and help you get ready to build your own automation. This is a presentation that I have done before at physical events, but I wanted to make some more virtual content available, so I hope that you find this helpful. First, I'm Kylie Kaiser. I work as a product owner at a financial services firm focused on Dynamics 365 or CRM, as some of us still call it. I'm located in the Washington, D.C. area and lead a local user group that I would definitely encourage you to check out, especially with a lot of the virtual content that we're doing right now. And I'm also a business applications MVP. So today, we're going to walk through some of the workflow options and scope. We're going to talk about the steps that you can put in a workflow. We're going to map out a process and then talk about how you review that process and reviewing your system jobs. First, let's talk about what a workflow even is. So a workflow is a process that our Dynamics 365 or CRM administrators can create for this behind the scenes automation. They are not going to allow user intervention while they're running. But they can be automatically triggered by an event, something that happens, or the user could trigger that on demand. And you're going to configure these in kind of the advanced settings area under processes or directly within a solution, which would definitely be my preferred method. And especially anytime you have multiple environments, you want to be making sure you're using your solutions to move your workflows between those environments. There are a few types of processes. Today, obviously, we're going to focus on workflows, but there are other processes that are available. First, we have an action. So these are steps that an administrator configures, but then they're called through code. So an example here could be maybe you don't have a developer on staff, or you don't have a developer always available to your team, right? But you have some complex logic that you want to create a plugin for, and as part of that, a task is going to be created. But we might be concerned that the business is going to change their mind about what that task is going to say. So we can design the task within our action, have our developer write the complex logic in the plugin, and call that action to create the task. Then, if the wording in that task needs to change, then I need just have my administrator change that action and re-import it with a solution, or however our process is, but kind of reduces a lot of the time needed to make that change, then needing to kind of dive into the code. We also have business process flows. So that's that little ribbon across the top of the record that gives you a step-by-step process to walk through specific types of records. Next, we have workflows that we're going to focus on today, and we've already kind of given you an overview there. And lastly, we have Power Automate. So this is where you're going to create flows. So these are outside of Dynamics, but still within the Power Platform. All of these will run asynchronously and can be triggered by lots of different things, actions, schedules, on demand. And there are so many options there within Power Automate to connect to different systems and have a lot of power. But let's focus on our workflows and talk about some of the options and scope. First things first, when you create a new workflow, you're going to get to this page, and there are three important things you're going to want to fill out here. The process name. This is very important to be consistent and descriptive. It's important to have some kind of standard within your environment of how you want to name these so that you can find them quickly and that people know what's happening and it's not hard for them to locate processes that might be doing certain actions or that they need to review. Next, we're going to choose the category. So this is the type of process. In this case, we're talking about workflows. And finally, we're going to choose the entity. So this is going to be your primary record, the record that you want to trigger this automation. You'll see we also have there an option for type, where you can choose if it's a new blank process or a new process from an existing template. So once you've been playing with workflows for a while, you do have the ability to save a workflow as a template, and then you can basically create a copy of it and use this to create similar workflows if you needed to do that. Now you get to this page, and I think this is where a lot of people can get a little bit fearful, because we have a whole bunch of options, we have a whole bunch of questions that you might not fully understand. So this is what we're going to really dive into and work through today. On the left-hand side, we have the available to run and the workflow job retention options. So available to run, we have the option to run this workflow in the background, meaning it will run asynchronously. Basically, any workflow that gets triggered gets added to a queue, and then these are run through and kind of in order. Your other option is real-time workflows, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and those kind of jump the line to go first. We also have the option to run as an on-demand process. This means that the user will select one record or multiple records and then can click run workflow in the old interface or run flow in the new interface and choose this on-demand workflow to trigger for those records. This is also really great for testing. So if you want to run on a few records and make sure your logic is firing as you expect it to, then you can use that on-demand process. And then we have as a child process. We're going to dive into this a bit later, but basically means it's going to be called from another workflow. Then we have workflow job retention. What this checkbox means is that it will, if your job runs successfully, your workflow runs successfully, then that system job record will get deleted right away. Generally, I recommend leaving this off initially, and after your workflows have run successfully for a little while and you validated everything is working, then you can modify them to check off that box and make sure they get deleted automatically. Next, we're going to move over to the right side of the screen where we see the start when and scope. So, and the start when and scope are very interconnected and related to the owner of the workflow. So it's important for you to kind of understand all of that, and hopefully you will after we walk through them. So here's our options for start when. We can start when a record is created, meaning when it's saved for the first time. When its status changes, so when we deactivate an account, when we win an opportunity, when we complete an activity, those kind of things. When the record is assigned, so this is when its owner changes. When records fields change, so you're actually going to be able to select the specific fields that you want to monitor, so that when they change, this workflow will trigger. And then when a record is deleted, so anytime that record is deleted, then this workflow is going to fire. And that's a time when you want to probably look at real-time workflows, because if you're running asynchronously, by the time this workflow runs, that data from that deleted record will no longer be there. Now, scope. So this is where I think a lot of people get confused. The easy answer is generally people are using organization, right? You can it's going to fire whenever the start when is met for any record in the system. And this is great, and we can still use conditions to kind of break down our the records that we want to act on. But I think it's important to understand the other scope options that we have. So if we're set to user scope, this means we're going to fire when the workflow owner is the same as the record owner for those start when conditions, right? So if the workflow is assigned to me and I have it set to user scope for, say, when accounts are created, then when accounts are created assigned to me, then this workflow will run. Anyone else who creates accounts assigned to themselves, this workflow will not run. Our next option is business unit. This means that anyone in the same business unit as the workflow owner would trigger this workflow, right? So say I am in the sales business unit and I own this workflow, any record created assigned to me or assigned to anyone else in the sales business unit would trigger this automation. Next, we have parent-child business units. So this means anyone in my business unit or below would trigger this record. So a way I like to think about this is we have, say, a sales business unit with several sales people business units underneath it. And on the other side, we have a marketing business unit with other marketing subsets, smaller groups underneath that. I might have certain automation that applies to sales and certain automation that applies to marketing. So I might want to put that one workflow in our sales side, assign that to a sales service account, and make sure that it's running for parent-child business units, so it will run for everything related to sales. And I can do the same thing on the marketing side. And then, of course, our last option is organization, which means it's going to trigger for all records when they meet that start when condition. This is generally, as I said, what people are using because a lot of times you do want to make sure that your automation is consistent. You don't want one salesperson handling things one way and somebody else handling it another way. Also, we probably have workflows related to data quality, which is going to apply to everyone across the whole organization. This is when it becomes very important to make sure you're putting conditions at the beginning of your workflow, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a minute. So let's talk about a few of those options that I skipped over. So first, real-time workflows. By default, your workflow is going to be set up to be asynchronous, so it's not running in real time. It's going to be added to a queue to be processed. But we will have a little button on the top ribbon to convert it to a real-time workflow. So this means that they're going to run as part of the same operation that triggers the workflow. So if we want this to run when accounts are created, then this will be running as part of that initial save operation. So our save won't complete until this workflow has finished running. I mentioned you're going to want to use real-time workflows when you look at deletion, right? Because we can actually have it run before the record is deleted, and we have the ability to prevent the user from deleting that record and return an error message if we wanted to do that. So you'll see that screenshot in the bottom of the screen shows a lot more options because we have the ability to run things before or after certain actions and kind of change the conditions a little bit more. And you'll also see that we can determine if this workflow is going to run as the owner of the workflow or if it's going to run as the person who made changes to the record. So that's important because generally all of our asynchronous workflows, they're always going to run as the owner of the workflow. So any changes that that workflow makes is going to have that workflow owner's name on it, which is a good reason to always make sure your workflows are owned by a system user, because you don't want something, modifying your accounts and then it has your name as an administrator on it, because then when that user wonders what's wrong with their account, they're going to call you, and you don't want them to do that. They need to understand it's part of a kind of an automation process that's running. But with your real-time workflow, this could be running as a part of that save operation, right? And so we want it to reflect the correct person making changes to that record. So this might be a time when you want to say, okay, let's not have it run as the workflow because we don't want, say, our new accounts to be shown created as our workflow user. We instead want it to run as the user who made the changes to the record. So whoever was trying to create that account or modify that lead, their name is still going to show as the created by or modified by item of that record. And reminder, best practice is to only use your real-time workflows when necessary, as these can impact performance. I like to think about real-time workflows as like the Starbucks mobile ordering. So I love mobile ordering at Starbucks because you feel like you're jumping to the front of the line, right? Because you'll get there and you've mobile ordered and there's all these people waiting, back when we could go places and there would be people waiting in line and everyone wasn't mobile ordering. But you'd get there and feel like all these people were waiting in line to order, but you jumped in and got to the front of the line and put your order in to get it made right away. And so that's kind of what our real-time workflows are doing. So if you have a large number of workflows that are running in real time, then they're all jumping to the front of the line, making all of your other processes kind of take a little bit longer. Generally, this is not going to cause a large impact, but when you start looking at having a lot of workflows running, then you want to start being careful. And we also briefly talked about child workflows. So child workflows are great to be able to break up complex logic into smaller pieces. Maybe you have a set of steps that you're going to repeat in multiple workflows. You could put that in a child workflow so that you could instead of needing to build that same logic multiple times, you could just call that child workflow. Although you do have to kind of plan that out a little bit, because the child workflow doesn't pass any data back to the parent, and the parent can't necessarily wait for the child to be completed. So you do have to be careful there. This is also recommended if you're using long wait conditions to kind of ensure that you're not waiting. Your wait condition and the following logic are disconnected. So what this means is, let's say we have a workflow that a lead is created, we're going to wait 6 weeks and then send an email, right? So day one, we launch our new workflow, we have all these leads come in and they get to that wait condition and they're waiting, right? And if this is all built as one workflow, and then your sales manager says, hey, there's a typo in the email, can you update your workflow? You're like, sure, great. But even if you update that workflow right away, anyone who already got in process and is waiting, they're in their 6-week waiting period, they're still going to get that old message, right? Because that workflow started and it's running already in progress. So it's going to keep running with however it was designed originally. But if instead I said lead is created, wait 6 weeks, then call a child workflow, then when it calls that child workflow, it's going to look for the most up-to-date information, and it would grab that new email or changes you made or whatever and be able to send that. So that's probably not a real case you'd want to use this for in real life, because you also do want to be careful with wait conditions and making sure they're really required, or maybe there's better ways to do this with Power Automate now and schedules instead of needing to put that all in a workflow. But still kind of helps you understand why a child workflow might make sense, or when you should at least be considering that option. So let's talk about who should own your workflows. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but when we're talking about automatic workflows, these are always going to run as the owner of the workflow. So this is definitely a time where you want to have a system user, a service account of some type, owning those workflows. And just remember, based on your scope, that might determine where that service account needs to live in your business unit hierarchy. This record is always going to show up as the created by or modified by for records involved in that workflow. So you do want to make sure that your users understand that this was part of an automation. It wasn't part of, you doing something or messing up their records, right? On-demand workflows are a little bit different, because those are always going to run as the user who clicked the button. So this makes sure that they can't be using a workflow to somehow bypass security and delete records or make changes that they shouldn't be using. So if your user triggers an on-demand workflow that does stuff they don't have access to, then that workflow is going to fail and not follow through on those actions. And then you'll see that in the system jobs, so you'll know that that user was trying to be sneaky. And then with real-time workflows, we already talked through this, but you can choose if that runs as the workflow owner, so it would be running similar to your automatic workflows, or if you want it to run as the trigger user, so the person who, saved that record that triggered the real-time workflow. And this kind of depends on what that workflow is doing, kind of how you want to determine that. And sometimes, workflows might not be the answer. So this is where our other processes came in that we talked about, actions, where you could have pieces of your workflow that are accessible through code or accessible through Power Automate, through flows. You can call actions there as well. Custom workflows. So these are code that are accessible through workflows, which we'll look at a little bit in the steps and custom steps section coming up next. And business process flows, so guiding user through certain steps. So maybe we don't want to automatically take an action, but we do want to show a user how to follow the process. We also have business rules, so showing and hiding certain fields, making fields required, setting certain field values. This is really good, especially on the form. So you might want to be helping the users with data quality instead of setting that after they leave the form with the workflow. And of course, we have plugins, we have Power Automate, we have lots of different things that we can do to help solve these problems. So let's talk about some steps and custom steps and what it looks like when you actually start building your workflow. So your steps are all going to be kind of logic. We're going to follow them in a logical order based on whatever we put in there. And you can see here on the right-hand side, we're seeing the different kinds of steps that we can add. Best practice is always to start with a check condition. So no matter what you think, if you think this workflow is going to run for everybody, there's always a case that it's not going to, right? So I do always recommend you start with a check condition, even if you're just checking that this record exists, because more than likely a user is going to come back to you in a few weeks and say, well, I don't want it to fire for these certain records or something like that. And usually there's something you do want to verify. If you're going to automatically complete an activity, you want to check it's not already complete. So it's important to kind of think through those things and figure out what conditions you need there. And then you can see we can add lots of different conditions to create logic with these check conditions, or to create records, update records, assign records, mark a record as complete, stop our workflow, all kinds of fun stuff. We also have the ability to add additional steps. So these are custom workflow steps that we briefly mentioned. So you can kind of allow a developer to write code that we call through a workflow so that non-developer or admins can kind of access these more advanced features. There are lots of free solutions already for this that you can import the solution into your environment and just start taking advantage of these features. So I definitely recommend you check out this blog that I'll include in the notes. And it just has a lot of, or several different solutions that you can download, and they all have great list of actions, more than you can ever think of, that you can just add into your workflow to add lots of complex functionality. Now, one thing I definitely recommend is anytime that you're starting a new process, you want to start by mapping it out. So why should I do that? A lot of that is to check for logical gaps, because you'll get a process from your users, but they might not fully understand what they're asking, or there might be items that they're not thinking of, right? And we want to prevent rework. So as much that I can do by drawing out a process at the beginning will help make sure I don't have to redo work at the end, right? It's also a great way to have some documentation that we can give to the user to sign off on and also save for later. Plus, if there's kind of multiple workflows involved in this automation or multiple use cases, it might show us where we could use a child workflow or other logic that we should be thinking of and including. So we're going to look at a quick example. So kind of really simple example, but we'll kind of walk through and hopefully bridge a lot of the conversation that we've been talking about. So our problem is that sales managers are not following up with leads. Very unrealistic problem. I'm sure it never happens in your organization. But we determined that our solution is to send a reminder email after that lead was assigned to say, hey, this was assigned 2 days ago, you should do something, right? So kind of some of our initial questions that start coming up from this are, do we want to do this all the time? Is there any exceptions? If they've already talked to the lead, do we still need an email? What if this lead gets reassigned? So these are all questions that we really kind of need to tease out with the business and find out how they want it handled in that situation. So we might build our first process map to be something like this. So lead is created, wait 2 days, send email to the lead owner, stop workflow, right? Simple, easy peasy, but it doesn't actually answer any of those questions that we were just talking about. And one note, we do have that stop workflow step there, which I've kind of included for consistency, I guess, and to make it easier to understand. But that stop workflow step doesn't, in asynchronous workflows, it doesn't really do very much. So there is some debate whether if it matters or if you should use it, but that's kind of a very personal decision. But so we did this, and one of our big questions is, what if they were already contacted, right? What do we want to do? So we could break this out into a few other options. We could just add in, after our wait, is the lead status still new? If not, stop workflow, we don't need to do anything. If it is, then can keep going and send our email like we were doing before. We also have the option to, instead of adding that check condition, we could instead do it with a wait and an otherwise wait. So as soon as that status equals contacted, we're going to stop workflow. Because this is kind of a relatively short wait, probably doesn't matter which option we select, but I did want to show you that we do have options here, right? And we do have different things that we could look at. So in this case, I think the option we're going to go with is option 1. So after we wait 2 days, then we're going to run our check condition and go on from there. So here we go. Business has signed off on that thing, so let's get started building it. We're going to fill in the process name. I started the name with lead because we have decided in our business terminology that we want all of our processes to start with the name of the entity first. And then we gave it a descriptive name, new lead reminder email, so everyone will know that's what's happening. This is a workflow, and we want to be focused on the lead because that is what we're going to trigger off of. So then we want to configure our settings. So first of all, this is a new workflow, so we want to make sure we uncheck automatically delete completed workflow jobs so that we can have a chance to review these. We don't want this to run on demand, but we're fine with it running in the background. Obviously, we couldn't run a real-time workflow that had a wait condition like this in it because you wouldn't want people waiting on the screen for 2 days. That's just not really a good user experience. In this case, we're going to set our scope to organization because we decided this should run for all leads, right? And we're going to start when that record is created. So whenever any lead in the organization is created, then this automation will fire for them. So next we're adding that wait condition, which is that first thing in our process diagram. So we're going to say wait 2 days, and we're going to configure that condition, which looks something like this. So you can go in and say our process timeout of 2 days after created on. You do have the option here in these wait conditions to do things like wait until lead status changes, wait until an activity is completed, or more complex things like that. I think you just have to be very careful with that. If you are, for example, if you're waiting for an activity to be completed, what if it never gets completed? How long do you want this waiting around kind of taking up space in your Dynamics environment, just waiting for something to happen? So it is generally recommended to use a timeout or include one of these process timeouts as one of your wait conditions to ensure that you don't have these waiting around forever. All right, so this is what this looks like now. We're going to time out 2 days after the lead is created on. So after our wait, now we're going to add in our conditional statement. So we're going to add in our condition. So if our lead is still equal new, then we're going to determine what happens next. So you'll see the little text box there. That's just typed in for us. But this data is actually also available in the system job. So it is recommended that you fill out those kind of name description fields because it can show up other places and can help you with some of your review of your system jobs. So here's how this looks like now. You can see that we have the different layers, which show kind of how the logic is working and help you follow visually what's going on. So now we're going to select below that if statement so we can determine what happens if the lead still equals new. And this is where we're going to choose to send that email message. So that's just choosing the send email step, and we're going to create a new message and fill out the properties. So we can fill out our properties with we're going to send it to the owner of the lead. We can include any additional details from that lead record that we want to include using that dynamic content pane on the right-hand side. You will notice that we didn't fill out the from because by default this will be from whoever owns the workflow. But you do have the option to send this from someone else. In that case, you would want to make sure that the person or service account or whatever account owns the workflow does have the privilege to send on behalf of another user, and that user will have to have their option set up to allow send from. So that's part of those personal options. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking of like sending automatic reminders to customers from their account owner and things like that. You have to make sure that you have those settings configured correctly. So we have our email set up, and then this is how our workflow looks, and we'll be ready to just add in. Otherwise, we're going to stop workflow, right? And this is kind of optional, so that whole otherwise piece is not necessary because it's not doing anything, but usually I like to include it just for cleanliness and to look nice. You do have the option if something is canceled, or especially like if you're using a real-time workflow, this would be how you'd configure that error message to return to the user if you wanted to kind of stop an action from happening or something like that. So now that we've built out our whole workflow, we are going to kind of review and see what's happening. And how you review this is in your system jobs. So a system job shows the status of any running workflow, steps completed, where it's waiting, all of that stuff. It would provide an error message if needed, and it's all viewable within your settings area. So this is kind of what your system job looks like. So this is our completed lead reminder email, and you'll see all the steps that were completed are checked off. Our otherwise step didn't need to happen, so it is not checked off, and we can see this is in a status state or in a successful state. You can see these, as I said, in settings, but you could also see it within a specific workflow. So opening up our workflow, we could jump down to the process settings area, and it will show you all of the times that workflow has run. Or you can even view it within a specific record. So this is a kind of screenshot from non-unified interface where you'd have background processes, but same thing that you can do in the unified interface. Just make sure you add that process relationship into that navigation as a related record, and then you can jump to the workflows related to that record whenever you need to, which can be really helpful for administrators if you want to see, hey, something weird is going on with this record. Let me see what processes have been executing on it recently. Just keep in mind, if you have that checkbox to remove successful workflows, that you aren't going to see those in any of these locations. But what if there's an error? Then it'll look something like this. You'll see, in this case, there wasn't a valid email, so we have an error at the top of that system job, and you can see we have the X errors all the way down the line to the last step that errored out. So one reminder is if you see kind of an error like that, you want to keep scrolling, especially if you have a long workflow with lots of different maybe if statements or wait statements, you want to scroll down until you find the last one, which is where the error actually occurred. And you'll see that there'll be additional messages within about the error details that you can look at. And these are fields that you can also pull into your advanced find if you wanted to, so that you can look for, any system jobs with data in that message field, so that you can review and be fixing them. And these errors can be caused by lots of things, right? Data issues with the record, logic issues with the workflow, potentially you're seeing interference with different plugins that are going on. And so all of those can be a little bit different. So it's really important to take time to review your workflows, review your system jobs, and make sure things are running the way you expect them to be. So let's jump into a few final thoughts and final recommendations that I would have as you're working on your workflows and getting started with them. So first of all, who should create workflows? One thing to think about is a lot of those out-of-the-box security roles give users access to create security roles. And I think this is a great ideal, right? Ideally, it would be nice if your salespeople could create workflows and could design their business process and kind of be using it to create automation for themselves. But in the real world, sometimes that can cause a lot of problems, right? Because they might not be thinking about everything else that's going on in the organization, right? And so generally, I would recommend that all of your workflows are controlled by your administration team, so that we can make sure we're providing consistent logic for the business and make sure that things are being done in the correct way. And this also, you kind of want to prevent individual users from making separate workflows and having two people working differently, or creating separate automation, just kind of recipe for disaster in there. Also, testing and deployment. If possible, you want to use a development environment. This gives you a place to create and test your workflows, make sure they're working as you expect, and then you can move them to a production environment using a solution. If you do not have a development environment, you should try and get one. I think especially if you're using Dynamics Online, you should have a free sandbox environment. So try and get that. But if you can't, this is when you could use run on demand or run as with the scope set to users. So you could test on a smaller subset of records, make sure it's doing what you want before you expand to everyone. But now kind of the new thing is, what about Power Automate? So within Power Automate, this is where you'll be creating flows. And these are all going to run asynchronously. They could be triggered based on actions happening in Dynamics 365 or the Common Data Service, or you can use schedules, which is something we can't use in workflows. They can be on demand, or they can be triggered by things completely separate from Dynamics 365. So all kinds of different connectors that you can use for your triggers or for your actions. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And there's also lots of templates to help you get started and get learning the tool. So I think right now it's kind of best to look at your business problem and then figure out the best solution based on that problem and based on what you want to do. So I think there is still a place for workflows, but it's also time to really start looking into Power Automate, learning what tools we have there, and then finding out how it can help. I think a lot of times, in my experience anyways, we have lots of workflows that have long wait times that are waiting for all these things to happen, or we could be using different kind of tricks to get around limitations of workflows. And a lot of those things are now handled in Power Automate. So maybe instead of a long wait condition, we have a schedule that runs every however many minutes to check for a certain action and run the next steps. Maybe we can kind of reevaluate how we've been solving problems, so that instead of looking for the tricks to get around issues with workflows, we can be looking for how we can do that with Power Automate. I think there is some debate on what's best, how it makes sense. I think previously a lot of people would say if all of your actions were happening within Dynamics, then that it makes sense to keep using workflows. But if you have anything that needs to go outside of Dynamics, that's when you want to use Power Automate. I think there's also an argument that can be made for just it's time to learn Power Automate, so let's start there, and if we can't do it, then go back to workflow. So I think you kind of have to decide for your organization where you kind of want to fall on that debate and how much, where it makes sense for you. And then based on whatever problem you're looking at, figure out what solution is best. So that's all I have for you. So if you have any questions, please put those in the comments or reach out to me via one of the ways I'm going to show you in a minute, and I would be happy to help you out. I do have a few resources available to you, some blogs that I've done in the past, and kind of lots of recorded webinars about workflows or other things for getting started for new admins, and I will put those links in the description as well. So just thank you everyone for being here, taking some time to learn about workflows with me. I hope that you will follow along with more things that I'm doing and follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I'd love to hear from you. I hope this was beneficial. Thanks.